He thought it was just another quiet drive, a night like any other. But when a foster child whispered 4 words, his entire life and fortune was seconds from being destroyed. The car glided down the quiet road, the hum of the engine steady, the streetlights throwing shifting patterns across the glass. Lila sat in the back seat, her small hands clutching the straps of her backpack, her gaze never still. At 8 years old, she had already learned to watch before she spoke, to notice things adults missed, to keep herself safe by reading the world like a secret language. Tonight was no different. She pressed her forehead against the cool window, eyes following the shadows that flickered along the pavement, but her attention kept drifting back to the car itself, to the way it moved beneath them. Each bump in the road felt wrong, not like the soft bounce she had grown used to on other nights, but heavier, unbalanced, as if the car was straining against something it couldn't quite carry. In the front seat, Adrian Vale scrolled through his phone, his sharp features lit by the pale glow of the screen. He wore his wealth the way some men wore armor, in the tailored suit jacket folded across the seat beside him, in the gleaming watch on his wrist, in the calm authority with which he typed one message after another. To the world, he was a billionaire, a man who had turned digital ideas into a fortune, who moved through boardrooms and private jets with the same ease other men walked through their front doors. To Lila, he was still something more complicated, the man who had signed adoption papers, but who had not yet figured out how to look her in the eyes without distraction. He had given her a house larger than any place she had ever seen, clothes that still smelled of new fabric, shelves lined with toys, but not the one thing she wanted most, the feeling of being seen. Her gaze dropped to the tires, spinning beneath them, the shadows moving strangely across the edge of the road. She had seen cars in worse shape during her years in foster care, wheels bent, brakes squealing, but this was different. Adrian's car was perfect, cared for by a driver who inspected it daily. Yet tonight it leaned when they turned, tilted slightly even on the straight path. She felt her stomach tighten with unease. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the quiet rhythm of Adrian's fingers on the screen. Lila shifted in her seat, her instinct telling her something was wrong, but her fear of being dismissed keeping her quiet. In other houses, speaking too soon, or speaking at all, had earned her sharp looks, or worse. She had learned to wait, to let adults reveal whether they were safe before she risked a voice. Still, the thought pressed heavier on her chest with each mile, and she glanced once more at Adrian, wondering if he would notice the wrongness she felt, or if he would continue to move through the night, blind to the danger that only she seemed to see. The car bumped again, harder this time, and Lila's hand tightened on the strap across her shoulder. She swallowed the words on her tongue, but her watchful eyes never left the road. The glow of the phone screen lit Adrian's face as the car moved steadily through the night. His eyes were fixed on the messages streaming across the display, words about contracts and numbers and deadlines, things that seemed to matter more than anything else. Lila sat in the back seat, her small frame almost swallowed by the leather cushions, watching the way his hand moved quickly over the screen and the way his brow tightened as he read. The silence inside the car felt heavy, filled only by the hum of the engine and the faint rhythm of tires against the road. But Lila's heart beat faster with each passing second. She had been quiet for as long as she could, holding the fear inside her chest like a secret. But the wrongness of the ride had grown sharper, undeniable, until she could no longer stay silent. She leaned forward slowly, her knees pressing against the edge of the seat, her small hand reaching out to touch the sleeve of his jacket. Her fingers tugged once, gently, but Adrian did not look up. He lifted his shoulders slightly, brushing her off as though she were nothing more than a passing distraction. "Just a minute," he murmured, his voice calm, his attention still fixed on the glowing phone. Lila pulled her hand back, biting her lip, her eyes darting to the dark stretch of road ahead. She could have waited. She had waited before in other places, in other houses, teaching herself to stay quiet, to avoid anger, but something inside her told her that if she stayed quiet now, there would not be another chance. She leaned forward again, her hand firmer this time, tugging harder until Adrian glanced toward her in annoyance. Before he could speak, she pressed her mouth close to his arm and whispered, her voice so small, yet so sharp, that the words seemed to cut through the dark. The tires are sliced. The effect was immediate. Adrian's hand froze above the phone, his head turning fully toward her for the first time that night. For a moment he simply stared, the words hanging in the air between them like something fragile and dangerous. His mind rushed to understand, replaying the way the car had tilted, the bumps that had felt wrong, the unease he had pushed aside as distraction. The phone slipped from his hand onto the console, forgotten. His chest tightened as he felt the weight of her whisper sink in. Lila sat back slightly, her wide brown eyes meeting his, not with fear but with certainty. She had no doubt in her voice, no hesitation, just quiet truth. The hum of the road seemed louder now, every turn of the tires pressing against his nerves. Adrian gripped the steering wheel tighter, his jaw set, his thoughts running faster than the car itself. He had dismissed her too easily, brushed her off as if her voice meant nothing, yet in that moment, those 4 words were all that mattered. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, broken only by the weak glow of passing streetlights. Adrian's pulse hammered in his ears as Lila's whisper echoed again in his mind. The tires are sliced. He gripped the wheel tighter, forcing himself to breathe evenly, but the steady hum of the car no longer sounded steady. It was off, uneven, like a heartbeat about to fail. His instincts, sharpened by years of making quick decisions in boardrooms and markets where one wrong move could cost millions, kicked in. Only this time, the stakes were not contracts or profits, but his life and the life of the girl sitting silently in the back seat. The first wobble came as they rounded a curve. The car leaned hard to the right, far sharper than it should have, the sound of rubber grinding against asphalt rising beneath them like a warning cry. Adrian felt his body tense all at once, muscles coiling, mind clearing of everything except survival. Without another thought, he pressed his foot down on the brake, hard, sending the car lurching forward with a violent jolt. The tires screamed, the steering wheel trembled in his hands, and the sleek black car shuddered under the strain. He fought it with every ounce of strength, steering carefully to keep it from spinning out as momentum pushed against them. The seatbelt cut sharply into his shoulder, and in the back, Lila held onto the strap across her chest, her eyes wide, but she did not make a sound. The car skidded across the lane, the smell of burning rubber filling the air, before finally grinding to a stop on the shoulder, inches away from the steel guardrail that divided the road from a steep drop into darkness. For a long moment, there was nothing. No hum of the engine, no voice, only the sound of Adrian's breathing, heavy and ragged, and the faint ticking of the cooling engine. His hands still clutched the wheel, knuckles white, as if letting go would allow the car to lurch forward again. His chest rose and fell quickly, but beneath the shock there was something else, a sharp awareness of how close they had come to disaster. 1 second later, one moment of hesitation, and they would not be sitting there. He turned his head slowly, meeting Lila's gaze in the rearview mirror. Her small face was pale in the dim light, her eyes steady, her lips pressed tight as though holding back words she was afraid to say. She had saved them, not the brakes, not his reflexes, but her voice, her warning, her insistence that he listen. For the first time in months of living together, he saw her not as the quiet child he was responsible for, but as the reason he was still alive. Adrian forced himself to loosen his grip on the wheel. The world outside the car seemed unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that comes only after chaos has passed. He drew in a deep breath and whispered a single word, one he had not used in years, his voice rough with disbelief and gratitude. "Thank you." Adrian pushed open the driver's door and stepped out into the cool evening air. the faint smell of burnt rubber still clinging to the road. The fading light stretched long shadows across the pavement. The horizon washed in deep gold that quickly gave way to gray. For a moment he simply stood there, steadying his breathing, the rush of adrenaline still burning through his veins. The car sat motionless on the shoulder, its sleek black surface reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. No longer the powerful machine it had been minutes before, but a trap that could have killed them both. He moved carefully around to the front, his footsteps crunching against gravel, and crouched near the first tire. At first glance, the rubber looked intact, but then he ran his hand along the edge and felt it, a series of sharp, deliberate cuts slicing across the tread. They were clean, too clean to be the result of wear or debris, marks made by a blade in steady hands. His chest tightened as he leaned closer, inspecting each line, realizing this was no accident. He moved to the second tire, then the third, and each told the same story. The cuts were precise, evenly spaced, deep enough to weaken the tires but not obvious to a casual glance. It had been planned, timed, executed with care. Whoever had done this had wanted him to drive far enough to reach speed, far enough for failure to mean disaster. Adrian straightened slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the road, as if expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. The stillness of the evening suddenly felt heavy, as if danger lingered in the air around them. He turned back toward the car, and his gaze caught Lila through the glass. She sat quietly in the back seat, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes locked on him. She didn't fidget, didn't look away, just watched him with the steady patience of someone who already knew what he was about to discover. He opened the door and leaned in. "You were right," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief and something close to shame. The tires were cut. Lila didn't smile, didn't gloat. She only nodded once, as if confirmation was unnecessary. "I saw someone," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm for a child. "In the driveway earlier, when you were on the phone. They bent down by the car. I thought it was strange." Adrian felt the words hit him harder than the jolt of the brakes had. He had been distracted, as always, his mind buried in contracts and deals, too busy to notice someone crouching near his own vehicle. The realization left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had built his fortune on awareness, on seeing angles others missed, yet here in his own home, danger had walked freely under his nose. He closed the door gently and stood in the growing darkness, his mind already racing. This wasn't random vandalism. It was sabotage, precise and personal. And if Lila hadn't spoken, if she hadn't warned him, tonight would have ended differently. Adrian slid back into the driver's seat, the leather cool against his back, the faint smell of burnt rubber still hanging in the air. His hands rested on the wheel, but he did not start the car. Instead, he turned his head slightly, looking into the rearview mirror, and saw Lila sitting there, small and still, her eyes fixed on him with a quiet steadiness that seemed far older than her 8 years. For the first time since she had come into his life, he felt himself really seeing her, not just as a child he had taken responsibility for, not as another name on a list of duties he meant to do well, but as someone who had just pulled him back from the edge of something deadly. The silence in the car pressed against both of them, and finally Adrian found his voice. "How did you know?" he asked, his words low, rougher than he intended. Lila lowered her gaze for a moment, her hands twisting together in her lap, before she answered. "I saw someone," she said quietly, "earlier today in the driveway. You were talking on the phone, and I was sitting by the window. A man bent down near the car. He looked around like he didn't want anyone to see him, then he stood up fast when you came outside." Adrian's breath caught, the weight of her words pulling at his chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Though he already knew, Lila's voice grew even softer, almost a whisper. "Because I thought you wouldn't believe me. Adults don't usually believe kids, especially kids like me. Induce." The truth of that statement struck him harder than the image of sliced tires. He remembered the way he had brushed her off minutes ago, the way he had told her to wait, as if her urgency were nothing more than childish impatience. He thought of how often he had dismissed her quiet presence since she had moved into his home, too busy with work, too distracted by meetings and messages, too comfortable believing that giving her things was enough. Now, sitting in the quiet dark, he realized she had seen what he had missed, and speaking up had cost her courage. He had not given her reason to trust would be worth it. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on her reflection in the mirror. Her brown eyes met his, steady now, waiting, searching his face as if to see if this time would be different. For once he did not look away. "You may have saved my life tonight," he said, and the words felt heavier than any business deal he had ever closed. Lila blinked, her lips parting slightly, surprise flickering across her features. She did not smile, not yet, but her shoulders loosened, and a tiny breath escaped her as if she had been holding it for far too long. Adrian sat in the silence, the weight of her whisper still echoing in his mind, and began to feel doubt grow where certainty once lived. Someone had cut his tires, someone had wanted him gone, and the only reason he was alive was because a child he had barely taken the time to know had dared to speak when it mattered most. The car sat silent on the shoulder of the road, its sleek frame gleaming faintly under the glow of distant streetlights. But inside, Adrian's thoughts moved restlessly, refusing to settle. He kept his hands on the wheel, though the engine was still, his eyes fixed on the dark stretch of highway ahead, but his mind had already left the road. Lila's words replayed again and again, and with them came a trail of memories that suddenly felt different. Details that had seemed harmless only days ago, but now pressed against him like unwelcome truths he could not ignore. He thought first of Marcus, his chief financial officer, the man who had been with him since the early days of the company when they were both running on caffeine and ambition, back when success was just an idea. Marcus had leaned across the table during their last meeting, his voice low, telling him that competitors were growing desperate, that whispers in the industry spoke of underhanded tactics, that Adrian needed to be careful. At the time, Adrian had brushed it aside, chalking it up to paranoia. But now the warning returned to him in a darker light. Was Marcus truly worried for him, or had he been planting the idea in advance, softening the ground so sabotage would not come as a shock? Then his thoughts shifted to Camilla. Her face, her smile, her voice, all of it lived in his mind with the kind of clarity that comes from months of intimacy. She had been the one to insist they take this route tonight, her hand warm on his arm as she suggested a slower drive away from the city, telling him it would help him clear his head before tomorrow's meeting. He had agreed easily, charmed as always by her soft insistence, never questioning why she cared so much about the path he drove. Now, with the evidence of cut tires still fresh in his mind, the choice of route felt less like a suggestion and more like a design. Adrian's chest tightened as he pieced these fragments together, his jaw tightening as the image of betrayal began to take shape. He thought of Camilla's sudden interest in his schedule, her habit of asking casual questions about his meetings, her way of tidying his office when he wasn't around, brushing her hand over his desk as if it were an act of affection. He thought of Marcus showing up unannounced at the house last week, carrying files he claimed couldn't wait until morning, slipping into his study with a familiarity that had once felt reassuring, but now made his stomach twist. He turned slightly, glancing at Lila in the back seat. She was quiet, watching him with the same steady gaze that had warned him in time. Her silence reminded him that she too had noticed things, that her sharp eyes had seen what he had ignored. For years he had trusted numbers, contracts, and polished presentations, but tonight he realized the truth often came in fragments, in details hidden between gestures and words, in the warnings of a child who had learned too young how to read danger. Adrian drew a long breath, the air sharp in his lungs, and admitted to himself what he did not want to believe. The attack had not been random, and the people closest to him might be the ones holding the knife. The house was quiet when they returned. The long driveway lined with trees that swayed gently in the night air. The faint glow from the windows giving the mansion a calm, almost deceptive sense of safety. Adrian parked the car slowly, his movements deliberate, his mind still tangled with the images of sliced tires and the weight of unanswered questions. He stepped out and opened the door for Lila, who climbed out without a word, her small backpack hugged close to her chest. Together they walked into the house, the echo of their footsteps filling the wide hallway. But neither of them spoke. It was only once the heavy front door shut behind them that Lila tugged lightly at his sleeve, her voice quiet but firm. "I need to show you something." Adrian followed her up the staircase, down the corridor to her room, a space filled with books and toys he had bought, though she rarely touched them. She moved straight to her desk and pulled out an old tablet with a cracked corner, its screen smudged from constant use. She tapped quickly, her small fingers sure in their movements, and then handed it to him without hesitation. On the screen appeared grainy photographs, taken at odd angles through her bedroom window. The first image showed the driveway, bathed in the pale light of the security lamps. A figure crouched low beside the car. The details were blurred, the camera struggling against the darkness, but the outline was unmistakable. Someone leaning close to the tires. Adrian's breath caught as he swiped to the next photo, then the next, each one capturing the same figure in different positions. He leaned closer to the screen, studying every shadow, every detail, and then froze when his eyes caught something he could not explain away. In the third photo, faint but clear enough to see, a strip of fabric trailed loosely from the figure's arm. A scarf, soft and light, patterned with pale colors that caught even in the weak light. He knew that scarf. He had seen it draped around Camilla's neck just 2 nights ago when she had laughed over dinner, the ends brushing against her hair as she leaned across the table. It was the scarf she had bought during their trip to Paris, the one she had insisted carried memories too dear to leave behind. Now it was captured in Lila's photo, trailing from the arm of someone crouching near his car in the middle of the night. Adrian felt his throat tighten as he stared at the image. He wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, a coincidence, anything but what it appeared to be. But Lila was watching him closely, her eyes steady, her voice calm. "I took them last week. She didn't know I was watching. I thought it was strange, so I kept taking pictures. I didn't want to be wrong." He set the tablet down slowly, his mind pulling in 2 directions at once. Camilla, with her easy laughter and gentle touch, the woman he had thought he might spend his life with, now appearing in the blurred outline of someone sabotaging his car. And Lila, the child he had barely listened to for months, presenting him with the kind of evidence he could not ignore. The truth was there in his hands, sharp and undeniable. And for the first time Adrian realized that her sharp eyes had been seeing what his had refused to. Adrian sat at the edge of his desk, the worn tablet still resting beside him, its screen frozen on the blurred image of the figure by his car. He could not take his eyes off the strip of fabric, that familiar scarf that had once been wrapped lovingly around his neck in the winter chill, a gift from Camilla that had felt personal and tender at the time. Now it stared back at him like a silent accusation. His mind fought against what his eyes saw, rejecting it, reshaping it, clinging to the comfort of disbelief. He thought of the nights they had shared, her laughter spilling into the quiet of his home, her hand resting softly against his chest as if she belonged there, the words she had whispered about forever. He had given her everything he could offer, not just wealth and security, but access to his life, his company, his heart, and yet, the evidence on the screen told a different story, one he could not bear to accept. He pressed his palms into his eyes, trying to push back the weight of it. Could the woman he trusted most really be the one orchestrating his downfall, watching him with eyes that calculated rather than cared? The thought made his stomach twist, but behind it came memories that now refused to stay hidden. The way Camilla had insisted they drive that particular route tonight, her soft voice suggesting it so casually he hadn't questioned it. The times she had lingered in his office under the excuse of organizing papers, her gaze lingering a second too long on contracts she claimed not to understand, the way she always seemed to appear with perfect timing, a cup of coffee in hand, a gentle smile ready, as if she knew his schedule better than he did. He had brushed it all aside, blinded by affection, by the comfort of companionship. After years of burying himself in work, he had wanted to believe her interest in his life was love, not calculation. Now, with the photo burned into his mind, he could no longer be certain. He looked across the room at Lila, who sat curled up in the armchair, watching him with quiet patience. She did not push him, did not speak, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who knew what it felt like to be betrayed by the people you were supposed to trust. Adrian's chest tightened as the truth pressed closer. Unwelcome, yet undeniable. If Camilla was involved, then every smile, every kiss, every moment of intimacy had been part of a carefully built illusion. He had been blind, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he had wanted so desperately to believe in the possibility of love. And now, that desire threatened to unravel everything he had built. He rose from the desk and paced the room, his hands clenched at his sides, his thoughts spiraling. He had built an empire by questioning motives, by finding flaws in perfect deals, by never trusting too easily. Yet when it came to the woman he shared his bed with, he had ignored every instinct. He stopped suddenly, turning back to Lila, her small figure a reminder of the warning that had saved him tonight. "If it's true," he whispered, his voice heavy, "then I've been living with my enemy." The words hung in the air, harsh and bitter, but he knew they were no longer just a possibility. The night pressed in around the house, but Adrian barely noticed the hours passing. He sat in the study with the dim lamp casting long shadows across the bookshelves, the weight of the tablet heavy in his mind even though it now lay dark on the desk. His thoughts turned over and over, searching for another explanation, but every path led back to the same place: the scarf, the crouched figure, the cuts in the tires. His chest felt tight as he tried to make sense of how trust could turn so sharply into suspicion. Lila was curled on the edge of the armchair across from him, her legs tucked beneath her, silent as she often was, her eyes tracing his every movement with quiet care. For a long time neither of them spoke, and it was as if the silence itself had weight, thick enough to make the air heavy between them. When she finally did speak, her voice was so soft, Adrian almost missed it. "There's more," she said, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. He lifted his gaze slowly, studying her, waiting, not pressing. She glanced at the floor before she looked back up, her brown eyes steady now, though her voice shook. "I've seen her with Marcus," she said, "when you weren't around. She talks to him in the hallway or the garden, sometimes late at night when I can't sleep and I walk to get water. They don't see me, or they don't care if they do." Adrian felt a chill run through him, sharp and cold. Marcus, his oldest friend, the man who had helped him build his company from nothing, whispering with the woman who had claimed his heart. The betrayal doubled itself in his mind, twisting painfully. He kept his voice level, though it came out strained. "What did they say?" Lila shifted in her seat, curling tighter into herself. "I don't understand all of it," she admitted, "but I remember words. I remember launch day and transfer. They said them more than once." Camilla's voice was quiet, but Marcus nodded, and sometimes they both looked around like they didn't want anyone to hear. She shook her head slightly, her tangled hair falling across her face. "I didn't know what it meant, but it didn't sound right. Not the way people talk when they're just friends." Adrian leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the pieces fall where they might. Launch day, transfer, words that belonged to his company, to the product he was preparing to unveil, the algorithm he had spent years developing. The words fit too perfectly with the shadow of betrayal already forming, and the more he tried to push them away, the clearer they became. Camilla and Marcus, together, speaking of timelines and movements as if he were nothing but an obstacle standing in the way of their plan. When he opened his eyes again, Lila was watching him with an expression that was part fear, part relief. She had carried this knowledge quietly, afraid it would be dismissed, just as she had been dismissed too many times before. Adrian felt the weight of her courage pressing against him. She had risked his disbelief, his anger even, to tell him the truth, because she had known it mattered. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice low but firm. "You did the right thing," he said. Her eyes softened, and for the first time since she had spoken, she let out a breath that seemed to release something she had been holding for weeks. Adrian sat in the silence that followed, the words "launch day" and "transfer" echoing in his mind, knowing they were not just words, but warnings of something far larger than he had been willing to see. The following morning the house was unusually still, the kind of stillness that follows a night where no one truly sleeps. Adrian had risen early, restless, his mind heavy with the weight of suspicion. He had spent hours pacing his office, replaying Lila's words until they echoed like a drumbeat in his head. When Josephine arrived just after sunrise, her usual calm presence filling the halls with order, he knew he could not keep this to himself any longer. She had managed the household for years, had known his parents before their deaths, and had watched him grow into the man he had become. More than that, she had a way of seeing things others missed, a clarity that came not from wealth or power, but from experience. He called her into the library, the place where his father once spent long evenings with books and his mother with letters. Lila was already there, perched quietly on the arm of a chair, her tablet tucked under her arm like a shield. Josephine entered, her dark eyes alert, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She looked between them and sensed the tension instantly. "Something is wrong," she said simply, not as a question, but as fact. Adrian drew a breath, glanced at Lila, then began. He told her about the sliced tires, about the sudden wobble on the road, about the moment Lila whispered the warning that had saved them both. He spoke of the photographs she had taken, the scarf caught in the frame, the conversations overheard late at night between Camilla and Marcus. Each detail seemed to hang heavier in the air as he laid it out, as though naming them gave them power. Lila added her part softly, explaining how she had watched from her window, how she had listened when she was supposed to be asleep, how the words "launch day" and "transfer" had lodged themselves in her memory. When they finished, Josephine remained silent for a long moment. She stood with the poise of someone who had carried many secrets over the years, her expression unreadable as she processed their story. Then she moved closer, her gaze sharpening, and when she spoke, her words were measured. "I have been watching her too," she said. "Camilla is careful, but not careful enough. She studies people when she thinks no one notices. She times her visits to match your business calls, always finding a reason to be nearby. She asks questions, not the kind a woman in love asks, but the kind of questions meant to gather information." Adrian felt the confirmation like a blow. He had hoped Josephine might dismiss it, might point to another explanation, but instead her words fit too neatly with his fears. Lila looked at Josephine with wide eyes, relief flickering across her small face at being believed again. The older woman gave her a gentle nod, a gesture of respect that made the child sit a little straighter. "She is not who she pretends to be," Josephine continued, her tone unwavering. "I do not yet know what she wants, but I know this: she is calculating. Every smile, every touch, every moment has purpose behind it. You must be careful, Adrian. Both of you must." Her words settled over the room with the weight of finality. The doubts Adrian had tried to resist now hardened into certainty. Camilla had not stumbled into his life by chance. She had entered with intention, and the life he thought he was building with her might already be nothing more than a carefully designed lie. Adrian sat at his desk long after Josephine left the library, the heavy curtains pulled shut, though daylight pushed against them. His office had always been his sanctuary, a space where order reigned and where every detail reflected control. The shelves were lined with carefully chosen books, the desk polished to a perfect shine, the monitors arranged with precision. Yet as he sat there now, every corner felt suspect, every shadow carried the weight of doubt. His eyes scanned the room not with pride but with suspicion, and the silence that once comforted him pressed against his ears like a warning. The first discovery came almost by accident. He reached for his car keys, still lying on the desk where he had dropped them the night before. Something about the weight felt wrong, heavier than it should have been. Frowning, he turned them over in his palm, the metal cold against his skin. Then he noticed it, a faint seam near the base of the fob, so small it could have been missed by anyone not looking. Using the edge of a letter opener, he pried gently until the casing shifted, and what he saw inside made his blood run cold. A tiny device no larger than a fingernail, sleek and black, nestled inside the hollow of the key. A transmitter, expertly hidden, silently recording his movements, his conversations, his life. For a moment he could only stare, the room spinning around him. He thought of all the times he had tossed those keys carelessly on tables, the times Camilla had picked them up with a laugh, twirling them in her hand as if it were nothing. The thought made his chest tighten, and he forced himself to breathe slowly as he set the keys down with deliberate care. If there was one device, there could be more. With grim determination, he began searching. He pulled open drawers, shifted books, examined picture frames. At first it felt like paranoia, the frantic grasping of a man too willing to believe the worst. But then he found the second. A small cylinder tucked inside the base of a lamp, wires so fine they could have been mistaken for dust. Then another in the air vent, its tiny red light blinking faintly like a heartbeat. In less than an hour he uncovered 5, each placed with precision, each invisible until pulled apart with steady hands. By the time he set the last one on his desk, the neat surface was covered in devices, their cold shapes staring back at him like evidence in a trial. He sat heavily in his chair, his heart thudding in his chest, his sense of safety collapsing piece by piece. The mansion he had always considered unshakable, a fortress against the world, now felt fragile, its walls thinner than paper, its silence no longer trustworthy. He rubbed his hand across his face, the weight of betrayal pressing harder with every passing second. When he lifted his gaze, he saw Lila standing quietly in the doorway, her small frame framed by the dim light from the hall. She looked at the table, at the pile of devices that glinted like shards of broken glass, and then back at him with the calm certainty of someone who already knew. Adrian felt the truth settle in his chest, sharp and unavoidable. His world was no longer secure, and everything he thought he controlled had already been invaded. The mansion was wrapped in silence that night, the kind of silence that seemed to wait for something to break it. Adrian sat in the shadows of his office, the lamp turned off, the curtains drawn tight. Across from him, Lila sat curled into the corner of a chair, her small tablet clutched in her lap, her wide eyes fixed on the door. They had been waiting for hours, the tension growing heavier with every tick of the clock, both of them holding their breath for the moment they knew would come. Adrian's jaw was set, his hand resting on the edge of the desk, his heart beating with a steady force that felt louder than the silence itself. The doorknob turned softly, and the door eased open. Camilla stepped inside, her heels in her hand, moving with the careful steps of someone who had done this before. Her beauty, the very thing that had once disarmed him, now looked like a mask, a weapon sharpened against him. She glanced around the office, her green eyes scanning the room, but the shadows kept him hidden. Adrian's breath stayed low in his chest, and Lila's fingers tightened around her tablet as they watched her move with quiet certainty. Camilla walked to his desk, her movements practiced, and set down a slim phone she pulled from her pocket. She pressed it to her ear, her voice low and measured, but the silence of the house carried it clearly to where they sat hidden. "Tomorrow the car finishes what we started," she whispered. "He won't make it to the meeting." The words landed like a blade. Adrian felt the ground tilt beneath him, the last of his denial collapsing. Every suspicion, every fragment of doubt, hardened into truth. The woman who had kissed him goodnight, who had smiled across candlelit dinners, who had whispered about forever, was planning his end. His hands clenched, nails digging into his palm as he fought to stay silent, to let her speak, to hear every word of her betrayal. On the other end of the line, a man's voice murmured, too faint to make out. Camilla nodded as though he could see her, her expression sharp and focused. "The tires are already weakened," she continued. "By the time he hits the highway, the rest will fail. No one will question it. An accident, nothing more." Adrian's chest ached, rage and grief twisting inside him. Lila's eyes darted to his, her small face pale but steady, as if reminding him to hold back, to let the truth unfold. Camilla's voice lowered again, softer, almost cold. "Everything is ready for the transfer. Marcus has the documents. Once Adrian is gone, the company falls easily. No one will stand in our way." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, her lips curling faintly in satisfaction. She stood for a moment, her gaze drifting over the office as though she owned it already, then turned toward the door, her footsteps light against the floor. Adrian did not move until the door closed and the silence returned. His heart pounded so hard it seemed to shake the air around him. Lila leaned forward, her whisper barely a breath, yet clear enough to shatter the last piece of denial he had clung to. "Now you know." Adrian closed his eyes, the weight of the truth pressing down on him, and in that moment, he understood what betrayal really meant. It was not just loss of trust, it was the breaking of something deep inside, something he would never rebuild the same way again. Adrian stood in the middle of his office long after Camilla had gone, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every part of him wanted to storm down the hallway, throw open her door, and demand the truth. He wanted to look her in the eye and see if she could still smile, still pretend, after whispering the words that promised his destruction. The thought of her lying so easily, of her using her voice to lace poison into his life, made his chest burn with anger. He could feel the confrontation rising inside him like a storm ready to break, but before he could move, he felt a tug at his sleeve. Lila was standing there, her small face lifted toward him, her brown eyes steady in the dim light. She didn't speak right away, as if she knew he needed that pause to breathe, but when she did, her voice was calm and certain. "If you go to her now," she said, "she'll lie. She's good at lying. She'll cry, and she'll say you're imagining things, and she'll make you doubt yourself again." Her words cut sharper than any blade because they were true. Adrian thought of the way Camilla's tears had softened him before, the way her voice could bend suspicion into guilt. He knew he was strong in business, ruthless in negotiations, but in love he had been vulnerable, open in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. If he confronted her with nothing but his rage, she would twist it, and he would find himself standing in the ruins of his certainty. He drew a harsh breath, struggling against the urge to move, to act. "I can't just sit here," he muttered, pacing across the room, the weight of betrayal pressing into his shoulders. Lila followed him with her eyes, not flinching, not wavering. "You can," she answered softly. "You have to. We need proof, something no one can deny. If you don't have it, she'll make you look like the liar." The bluntness of her words startled him, the clarity in them far beyond her years. He turned toward her, studying her small frame, the way she stood rooted in truth as if she had carried this burden before. He realized then that she had, in her own way. A child in foster homes learns quickly who to believe and who to fear, learns that speaking too soon can mean punishment, learns that truth without proof is a dangerous thing. Lila had survived by holding her words until she could not be silenced. Adrian felt his anger shift, cooling into something sharper, something controlled. She was right. They needed more than suspicion. They needed evidence so clear, so undeniable, that even Camilla's charm could not cover it. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his body loosening just enough for him to think again. "All right," he said, his voice quieter now. "We wait. We watch. And when she shows us the rest, we'll be ready." Lila's expression softened, her shoulders relaxing, though her eyes stayed alert. "She'll give herself away," she said. "People like her always do. We just have to be patient." Adrian lowered himself into the chair behind his desk. The anger still alive inside him, but no longer wild. It was now a fire he could control, one that would burn steady until the moment came. Across from him, Lila sat down, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, and for the first time he felt not just the weight of responsibility for her, but the strength of having her beside him. She was not only a child he had taken in, but the only person he could trust completely. As the house settled back into silence, Adrian stared at the door Camilla had walked through only minutes before. And he knew the choice had been made. He would not confront her with words that could be denied. He would confront her with proof. And when that moment came, there would be no escape for her lies. The house seemed to hold its breath as night settled over it, every creak of the wooden floors and every whisper of the wind against the windows sounding sharper than usual. Adrian moved through the rooms with deliberate care, his steps quiet, his mind focused on the plan that had taken shape after long hours of tense conversation. Josephine had brought out a small box of surveillance equipment she had kept stored for emergencies, devices Adrian himself had given her years ago after an attempted break-in. At the time she had laughed, saying she had no use for such complicated things, but she had kept them all the same, tucked away in her careful way, as though she had known a day like this might come. Now, those small black cameras and audio bugs were being placed around the mansion, hidden in corners and fixtures, each one positioned to watch without being seen. Adrian crouched by the fireplace in the study, securing a camera behind the carved molding. He worked quickly, his hands steady, his movements exact. Lila stood nearby, holding a small flashlight for him, her face serious and intent. She asked no questions, made no unnecessary noise, only followed his instructions with the calm focus of someone who understood the stakes better than any child should. When he was finished, she passed him the next device without hesitation. Across the hall, Josephine moved with quiet efficiency, slipping another camera into the base of a lamp and adjusting it with the skill of someone who had spent her life watching over others without being noticed herself. By the time the preparations were complete, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage, and every room a trap, waiting to be sprung. Adrian sat with Lila and Josephine in the library, the monitors glowing faintly before them, their faces lit in cold blue light as the feeds flickered to life. Every angle was covered, every doorway and corner held in view, and the silence between them was thick with anticipation. It was just past midnight when Camilla appeared on the screen, her silhouette graceful as ever, her smile faint as she slipped into the study. She looked every bit the devoted fiancée, her hair falling over her shoulder as she set her purse down with delicate ease, but the phone in her hand and the sharpness in her eyes betrayed her. She dialed quickly, her voice low but clear in the room as the microphone picked up every word. "Marcus, it's done," she murmured. "Tomorrow, he walks into the trap. The contracts will be signed under your name, and by the time anyone notices, Vailtech is ours." On another screen, Marcus appeared in his own office, papers spread across his desk, his movements brisk and confident. He leaned forward, speaking into his phone, his voice edged with triumph. "The investors are ready. Once the launch day collapses under his absence, the transfer will look seamless. No one will doubt the story we've built." Adrian felt the breath leave his chest as he listened, not with shock this time, but with the clarity of confirmation. Every word was recorded, every betrayal documented, every detail captured in a way that could not be denied. Lila's eyes stayed fixed on the screen, her small hand gripping the edge of the chair, her face pale but resolute. Josephine sat tall, her lips pressed tightly together, her gaze sharp as steel. For years, Adrian had lived by control, believing his wealth and intelligence were shields against betrayal. Tonight, he learned that trust was the real weakness, and that even the closest smiles could hide sharpened knives. But as the cameras recorded Camilla's soft voice and Marcus's arrogant promises, he also knew that the balance had shifted. The predators were exposing themselves, and soon they would find out what it meant to be hunted. The moment felt heavier than any boardroom Adrian had ever walked into. The study doors swung open, the hinges giving a soft groan that cut through the low murmur of Camilla's voice. She stood near his desk, phone pressed to her ear, her tone sharp with calculation. Marcus's voice crackled faintly on the other end, filled with confidence, almost smug. For a heartbeat, the three of them froze, the air caught in a taut silence. Adrian's figure filled the doorway, his face carved in stone, his gaze locked on the woman who had once been the center of his world. Camilla recovered first, her lips curved into the smile he knew too well, a smile crafted to soothe and disarm. She slipped the phone into her purse as if nothing had been said, her voice softening as she reached toward him. "Darling, you startled me. I was just checking in with Marcus about tomorrow's presentation. You've been so tense, I thought I could handle some of the details for you." But Marcus's voice betrayed her. Still on the line, unaware the game had shifted. "The contracts are already doctored, Camilla. By noon tomorrow, Valtech is ours." The sound of his laughter echoed faintly before he ended the call. The silence that followed was brutal, stretching over the room like a blade poised to strike. Camilla's smile faltered, then returned, brittle and desperate. "You don't understand, Adrian. This isn't what it looks like." She moved closer, her hand outstretched, as though touch could erase what had been heard. Her voice lowered, coaxing, almost pleading. "You know me. You know I would never hurt you. We've built something real." But Adrian did not move, did not soften. His eyes were colder than she had ever seen them. The warmth she had once fed on replaced with a steel she could not bend. "What you've built," he said quietly, "is a lie." Before she could respond, he reached for the remote on his desk. With a click, the speakers filled the room with the sound of her own voice, captured earlier by the hidden devices. Her words played back with merciless clarity. "Tomorrow the car finishes what we started. He won't make it to the meeting." Every syllable rang out, undeniable, cutting through her practiced composure. Camilla's mask shattered. The softness in her eyes vanished, replaced by something cold and sharp, a predator cornered. "So you think you're clever," she spat, her voice stripped of charm. "You think you can outplay us? Marcus and I have already put everything in motion. By the time you drag us down, your reputation will be ashes." Adrian stepped closer, his presence filling the room, his voice calm and unshaken. "The difference between us, Camilla, is that I don't gamble without certainty. Every word you and Marcus have spoken has been recorded. Every detail of your betrayal has been captured. When the world hears it, there will be no doubt who destroyed what." For the first time, Marcus's arrogance broke through the phone still lying open in her purse, his voice rising with fury as he realized he too had been caught. But Adrian no longer needed to listen. He had what he needed, and the trap had finally closed. Camilla's eyes flashed with fury, but beneath it was fear, raw and unmasked. Adrian looked at her one last time, his voice final. "You played me well, but the game is over." The sound of sirens grew louder until they filled the night, red and blue lights flashing across the long windows of the mansion. Adrian stood in the center of his study, his arms folded across his chest, his expression calm, though his heart pounded like a drum inside him. Camilla sat in the corner of the room, her charm gone, her face pale but defiant, while Marcus's angry voice still echoed faintly through the open line before the call had been cut. Josephine stood by the door, her chin raised, ready to let the authorities in. And beside Adrian, small and steady, stood Lila, her brown eyes unblinking as if she understood that this moment was not just an ending, but a beginning. The doors opened with a heavy thud, and federal agents poured in, their voices sharp, their movements efficient. Within seconds, Camilla was on her feet, her hands lifted, her protest already spilling from her lips. "This is a mistake. You don't know who I am. I'm not part of this." But the agents didn't hesitate, their instructions precise, as they pulled her hands behind her back and snapped cold metal around her wrists. She tried to twist, tried to turn her face back toward Adrian, her voice rising in desperation. "Tell them, Adrian, tell them this isn't true." But he did not move, did not speak. He had already heard every truth that mattered, and he knew there was no place left for her lies. Moments later, another group of agents stormed Marcus's office downtown, the reports streaming into Adrian's phone as the plan unfolded. Marcus Wren, the man who had once stood at his side as a partner, was dragged out in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage as cameras flashed, the headlines already beginning to write themselves. Corporate sabotage, conspiracy, attempted murder. His empire of deceit collapsed in a single night, exposed by the very arrogance that had convinced him he was untouchable. Camilla was led past Adrian, her eyes flashing with fury, even as fear trembled just beneath the surface. She hissed his name, her voice sharp and venomous, but he only looked at her with the quiet finality of someone who no longer owed her a word. The woman he had loved was gone, and what remained was nothing more than a mask shattered beyond repair. When the house grew still again, when the agents had left with their prisoners and the flashing lights faded into the distance, Adrian lowered himself into the leather chair behind his desk. The weight of what had almost been lost pressed hard against him, and he closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence settle. His empire had nearly fallen, not because of market shifts or business rivals, but because he had let love blind him to danger. And yet it had been saved. Not by his millions, not by his power, but by the soft whisper of a child who had refused to let fear silence her. He looked across the room at Lila, who now sat quietly in the armchair, her legs tucked beneath her, her eyes meeting his with a calm certainty that seemed far older than her years. He thought of the night she tugged at his sleeve, of the moment she had leaned close and whispered words that had frozen his blood. That single moment had changed everything. He rose and crossed the room, lowering himself to her level, his voice soft but steady. "You saved me," he said simply. Lila blinked, her lips parting, but no words came. Instead, she gave him the smallest of nods, a gesture of trust that was more powerful than anything else. Adrian felt something shift inside him, something that told him his life had been altered in ways far deeper than business or betrayal. He was no longer alone, and his empire, rebuilt on truth and trust, would stand stronger because of her. The weeks that followed passed with a quiet steadiness that Adrian had not known in years. The chaos of the arrests had faded into the rhythm of court hearings and business repairs, the headlines slowly shifting to other stories, leaving him with something far more important than the empire he had nearly lost. The mansion no longer felt like a stage for betrayal, its walls no longer heavy with suspicion. Instead, it carried the sound of footsteps that were light but confident, and the laughter of a child who was finally learning that her voice could fill a room without fear of being silent. Adrian stood in his study on a bright afternoon, the sunlight streaming across the polished floor, his eyes drawn not to the stacks of contracts or the framed awards that lined the shelves, but to the drawings taped carefully on the wall beside his desk. They were simple, crayon sketches of a house, a tree, a figure with dark hair standing tall beside a smaller one, with a wide smile, but to him they carried more weight than any business achievement. They were symbols of something he had not even realized he was missing, the fragile but unshakable bond of trust that turned strangers into family. That morning, he had signed the final papers that made Lila his daughter in the eyes of the law. The adoption had been a formality in some ways, but as he had held the pen, he felt the significance settle deep inside him. It was not obligation that guided his hand, not reputation or appearances, but choice. He wanted her, not as a duty to be carried out, but as someone he could not imagine his life without. When the judge had handed him the documents, he had looked down at Lila, who sat quietly beside him in her neat dress, and had seen tears in her eyes. Not tears of fear or loss, but of something rarer, belonging. Now she sat in the armchair across from him, her legs curled beneath her, a notebook open in her lap. She was sketching again, her tongue caught lightly between her teeth in concentration, but when she noticed him watching, she did not look away as she once would have. Instead, she grinned, holding up the page to show him a new drawing. This one was of his study, the shelves behind him, the desk in front of him, and the two of them sitting together, side by side. Adrian crossed the room and knelt beside her, studying the lines, the simple shapes that somehow carried so much truth. "It's perfect," he said, and meant it more than he had meant any words in a long time. Lila's eyes lit up, and she leaned against him with a trust so natural it almost broke his heart. He thought of the night she had leaned forward from the back seat, whispering the words that had saved his life. She had been afraid then, afraid she would not be believed, afraid she was just another child whose voice would vanish into the noise of adults who never listened. But now she spoke freely, her words welcomed, her silence no longer a shield but a choice. Adrian looked at her and understood that wealth was not counted in millions or trophies, but in the trust that bound two people together after surviving what could have broken them apart. He had once thought himself a man who owned everything, but it was only now, with Lila's hand resting in his, that he realized he had finally found what mattered most. The mansion no longer felt like a hollow shell filled with expensive things. Weeks after the trials ended and the chaos died down, Adrian began to notice the difference in the smallest details. The halls that once echoed with silence now carried the sound of Lila's footsteps as she darted between rooms, her laughter spilling into corners where suspicion once lived. His study, once dominated by screens, contracts, and the polished surface of his desk, now held more than just evidence of his career. Crayon drawings covered the walls near the window, bright colors taped beside the gleaming plaques and framed awards. A family tree drawn with shaky lines sat above a certificate of excellence in technology, and he found himself glancing at the drawing more often than the award. His days were no longer consumed only by meetings and calls. He still ran his company, still moved through boardrooms where his voice carried weight, but when he came home at night, the house did not feel like a retreat he barely touched. It felt alive. Lila would run to the door with some new discovery, a page she had read, a sketch she had finished, a question she had been waiting to ask. Josephine still kept the household in order, but there was a warmth to her movements now, as though she too had been waiting for this shift, for the moment the house finally became a home. One evening, Adrian sat at his desk, papers spread before him, the glow of the desk lamp soft against the wood. He paused, his eyes drifting to the drawings on the wall. The company he had built, the millions he had earned, all of it seemed strangely small compared to the change that had happened in this room. He remembered the night Lila had leaned forward from the back seat of the car, whispering the words that saved his life. At the time she had been cautious, unsure if her voice would be heard. That whisper had been more valuable than every contract he had ever signed. It had cut through the noise of his distractions and reminded him that true fortune was not measured in numbers but in trust, in courage, in the bond that grows when two lives learn to depend on each other. Adrian leaned back in his chair, the realization settling into him with quiet certainty. His empire could rise and fall, fortunes could be made and lost, but nothing could replace the sound of that small voice, the one that had refused to stay silent when it mattered most. That voice was his real fortune, the reminder that sometimes the greatest wealth comes in unexpected forms. The next morning, as he hurried to his car, his mind already racing with the schedule ahead, he placed his coffee cup on the roof. While unlocking the door, he slid into the seat and reached for the ignition, only to hear a soft giggle from behind him. Lila leaned forward, her eyes sparkling, and whispered in the same way she had that night, only now with light-hearted mischief. "Don't forget, your coffee's on the roof of the car." Adrian turned, caught off guard, and then he laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. It was the perfect reminder that his greatest treasure was not what he had built, but who he had found. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.